Kia ora. Good morning, everyone. Kia ora. Welcome to Cobblestones Chronicles, another chance to talk about all the wonderful things that happen at Cobblestones and to give you some history of the Wairarapa and indeed some history of New Zealand. I've got a new book that I want to talk to you about today, which is great. It's called Touring Edwardian New Zealand by Paul Moon. And it's all about the Edwardian period, which was actually relatively short because it was the period that immediately followed the Victorian period. But it's really interesting book. It's by a chap called Paul Moon. And I used to work with Paul many years ago, in the 1990s, when he was a young lecturer at AIT, as it was then, became AUT, Auckland University of Technology, in the year 2000. And Paul was then carving out his career in the Te Araputama, which is the Maori faculty. And he's a wonderful historian. And I've been following his books and his writings ever since the 1990s. And he just produced this book, Touring Edwardian New Zealand. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it and read you some extracts from it this morning. And I'm also going to talk about some of our street names and continuing the history of our streets in the Wairarapa in our towns. And I'm going to talk to you about Cobblestones Museum. We've got an exciting concert coming up on Sunday, the 22nd of January, which will be great fun. It's a concert with the Zimmermans, who are an excellent band, and they play all Bob Dylan music. I don't know about you, but I'm a Bob Dylan fan. And I've been following him since the 1960s. Seems not that long ago, but of course it is. But before I do that, I want to play you a CD. And the song I'm going to play is about Opo the dolphin, who was a dolphin who hung around on the Coromandel Peninsula, and he was really friendly, but it was. People couldn't figure out why he kept hanging around, but he would play with the children and he'd play with balls that got thrown to him. And he was a wild dolphin who just loved hanging out with people. So this is Opo the Crazy Dolphin, and it's from a CD called Tales from God's Own by a chap called Priestley. And this is, it says Songs of New Zealand's Distant Past, but this one isn't quite so distant. It's only from the 1950s. So here we go, Opo the Crazy Dolphin.
One, two, three, four. Opo, 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 Opo. I'm Opo the crazy dolphin. Kids think I'm RT, and I give them all a fishy back ride or a game of ball in the swishy tide. I'm one fish that will never be fried or served in batter for tea, and I live in Opanoni by the sea. Opo, 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 Opo. Oh, everybody loves him at Opanoni Bay. Well, he's such fun for old and young. They all want him to stay, 'cause he's Opo the crazy dolphin, as friendly as can be. If you should want to learn to swim, you couldn't do better than to learn from him. and very soon he'll get you into trim. He's giving instruction free down at good old Opanoni by the sea. Opo, 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 Opo. Oh, Dad has to leave his golfing, the family all agree. Sea air is good for everyone, and Janet and John should get some sun. And much more fun than a hole-in-one is a game of ball with me down at good old Opanoni by the sea. Opo, 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 Opo. Oh, everybody loves him at Opanoni Bay. Well, he's such fun for old and young, they all want him to stay. 'Cause there never was such a dolphin in the whole of the Tasman Sea. Across the waves he likes to shoot, you never saw a fish that looks so cute. She never even wears a bathing suit, not even a bikini, and he lives in Opanoni by the sea. Opo, 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 Opo.
Opal the Crazy Dolphin. So a bit of history from New Zealand. And of course, things like that were what attracted people to the first tourists to come to New Zealand, because New Zealand was seen as a very exotic place to come, although fairly safe because we spoke English, unlike some of these other foreign parts. I have a little story about speaking English, because I don't know if you've noticed that there are many different variants of English. And of course, my Scottish accent doesn't help. But we, in Scotland, we do speak Scots. There is a slightly different language, and we have a few different words. And when we took my dear New Zealand-born and bred husband to Scotland, my sister and brother-in-law and nephew live in the west of Scotland, and they live in the southwest, which is, of course, Robert Burns country. And if you've ever tried to read any of Robert Burns' poems, for example, To a Moose, starts off, "Wee, curn, timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie, you shouldn't have ran away so hasty with Bricker and Brattle." Now, I wonder if you know what that means. So my poor New Zealand husband was left struggling with my nephew and my brother-in-law, who speak just like that. They have broad accents and use different words. So we ended up, my sister and I bought him a dictionary, a Scots English dictionary. But of course, in New Zealand, we speak fairly good English, a few interesting words like chur and sweet as and brow, but that's reasonably understandable. So it would, although seem exotic, and of course with an exotic Maori peoples here, fairly safe to come. And I want to read you a little bit about travel in New Zealand. The Edwardian age lasted until around 1910, although it is often extended to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And while it was largely a continuation of what preceded it, there were perceptible shifts taking place in much of the English-speaking world. It has been represented as the salad days before the horrors of the First World War, where rural idols were places of serenity, flower-lulled in sleeping grass, as Rupert Brooke nostalgically put it. while the urban centres were bustling with a burgeoning middle class that was acquiring greater prosperity and the opportunities that came with that, including travel abroad. So this is the era where the middle classes in the UK and indeed around much of the rest of the world rose up. And they did have more leisure time and more disposable income. And from gardening to literature is how Christmas was celebrated. Much of the country was happy to emulate the social and aesthetic trends that had taken back home in Britain. So Paul goes on to say, today, Edwardian New Zealand is at once very close to us, yet extremely remote. The architecture of that era still features as part of our nation's built landscape, and most of the natural attractions that drew tourists to the country in the first decade of the 20th century retain their appeal to visitors. The most popular sports at that time, rugby, cricket and tennis, remain favourites in New Zealand, while the basic form of government that prevailed at the time, in other words the Westminster system, is still largely intact. On the other hand, many aspects of this period would be foreign to contemporary New Zealanders. Gender roles were distinct and strictly delineated. There were still no women members of parliament or business leaders. The indigenous Maori population was segregated in many ways, typically by social practice rather than by law, and was considered to be a dying race. Society as a whole was more morally tight-knit or uptight, depending on your perspective. And internationally, New Zealand was still umbilically attached to Britain, diplomatically, economically, and culturally. So Britain was, of course, the big market for our wool and our sheep meat and our butter. And it was the place where many people went home to visit. And there was considerable justification in the country clinging to its image as the Britain of the South Seas. So in November 1902, the travel agency Thomas Cook published a guide to what New Zealand offered, mainly to attract British tourists to the country. This remarkable volume with the cumbersome title, New Zealand as a Tourist and Health Resort, a handbook to the Hot Lake District, the West Coast Road, the Southern Lakes, Mount Cook, the Sounds, etc., provides an extremely rare insight into the nature of New Zealand at the start of the Edwardian era, and how this fledgling state wished to parade its attributes to overseas visitors. In the main centres, the country appeared to have shed its colonial skin and had emerged as a modern, urbane and perkily self-assured nation. Small in comparison to its European counterparts, but apparently striving for all the traits of a developed European nation, while still harbouring its status as an antidote to the crowded urban life many Britons now endured. Yes, New Zealand's cities and towns were clean, new and charming, but it was in the hinterland where the real New Zealand, wild, exotic and Maori, existed, waiting to be discovered by the intrepid traveller. And the South Island really still epitomises much of that. So I'm going to play a song now called Southern Land, which is all about the South Island. This was written by Niels Gedge, who just happens to be my husband, and it was written during a trip that we were making around the South Island a few years ago. It would be about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. And it was lovely, and he was enchanted by our time in the Caitlin's and around the Sounds and the Southern Lakes, and wrote this song to celebrate our beautiful Southern land. So here we go, by Niels Gedge.
southern lands. Take my heart, the light is born to your chiming song. Take my heart, southern land, the clock of night lifts for your dawn. Moss and fern, vine and tree, the forest sips at your waterfall. Rock and sand, turquoise sea, last light lost on a seabird's call.
Take my heart,
let my eyes awaken
southern land,
to your forests and mountains.
Take my heart,
it's yours for the taking,
southern land,
my muse and my fountain.
Take my heart,
it beats to your rhythm,
southern land,
this is where I stand my ground.
Take my heart,
it's beaten to your rhythm,
southern land,
as the world turns around and around and around and around. Southern land, forged by fire, formed by sea, glacier gouge and torrential rain. Dust to dust, I shall be held by love to your waking dream.
Take my heart,
let my eyes awaken
southern land,
to your forests and mountains.
Take my heart,
it's yours for the taking,
southern land,
my muse and my fountain.
Take my heart,
it beats to your rhythm,
southern land,
this is where I stand my ground.
Take my heart,
it's beaten to your rhythm,
southern land,
as the world turns around and around and around and around and around and around and around. Southern land,
Southern Land, a lovely song with a lovely reminder of the trip around the South Island. And many people who did travel around New Zealand loved it. They thought it was wonderful. And they were very adventurous. They did lots of things. And of course, this was also the time when lots of middle-class people started to look and see, well, if they wanted to get some land, if they wanted to get on in life, because this was with the real rise of the middle classes in Edwardian times, what might they do? And of course, we had people who then came out to New Zealand because there was the promise of land, which is was very difficult then to buy in the UK. And it was also setting up of towns. So this morning, I thought I'd talk about Martinborough a little bit, because Martinborough really took off in the early part of the 20th century. Martinborough was the last of the Wairarapa towns to be established, and the only one to have been successfully established as a private town. The story of how the Honourable John Martin bought a farm and subdivided a town out of its southern portion is well known, but less so is the fact that his town adjoined another town, one already laid out and formed. Waihenga was a Maori village on the banks of the Ruamahanga, the name Spreading Waters illustrating the river's habit of spilling out over the flat lands in the vicinity. The Wellington Provincial Council established a ferry at Waihenga and built a hotel. J.D. Baird, the council's engineer, obviously thought there was profit to be made from establishing a town in the area of the ferry and bought some land on the northern boundary of the old Wharekaka station. He published his plans on October 1870 for a township he called Baird's Town, which was also known as Waihenga or Wharekaka. His township never flourished, and although some of the land was sold, it wasn't until his brother-in-law, John Martin, purchased the neighbouring Huahangaraua station in 1879 and offered the southern portion of that run for sale that unique Martinborough township took place. And what a shape! John Martin was born in County Londonderry, Northern Ireland. He was the son of a retired clergyman who had taken up farming. He was one of 11 children who were orphaned by typhus in 1838. Martin journeyed to New Zealand with his siblings in 1840. Johnny Martin, as he was soon known, set about establishing himself in the small township of Wellington, labouring with a pick and shovel before graduating to horse and cart, obviously not afraid to roll his sleeves up and get stuck in. In partnership with his brother-in-law James Smith, he took out a pastoral licence in Otago in 1860 on land that included the gully where Gabriel Reid was soon to make his famous gold discovery. Within a year, the pastoral licence was cancelled, but the partners sold their stock to the miners and carted gold to Dunedin. Martin was soon a wealthy man, and he returned to Wellington to establish himself as a merchant. Once again he thrived and became involved in local politics, although his volatile temperament was not really suited to the political process. Well, he was from Northern Ireland, wasn't he? And I have to say that a lot of Northern Irish people I know are passionate about things, and they really do get stuck in. He was more adept at commerce, and he flourished, purchasing Otaria Station south of Martinborough and New Zealand Navigation Company the same year. In 1875, he took a trip abroad, reportedly to marry off 2 of his daughters. It is said in the family he intended they marry members of the Irish aristocracy. One daughter, however, ended up marrying the ship's captain and the other the ship's doctor. This trip, for which he left from his own Wellington hotel, the Panama, and travelled in his own ship, the Taranaki, was to prove the inspiration for his street names in the future. Martin purchased the Huarangarua property of G.M. Waterhouse and promptly subdivided it into over 300 small farms and 600 urban sections adjoining Beardstown. He renamed his town Martinborough and laid it out in the shape of the Union Jack. And if you go to Martinborough and you stand in the town square, you can see that's exactly the shape it still is today. There have been very few new streets in the township of Martinborough since Baird's and Martin's plans were drawn. A subdivision was planned off New York Street in the 1900s with a block of streets bearing the names of native trees, but it wasn't ever carried out. The J.D. Baird's plan has few streets added, but there has been little change to the map of Martinborough, the town that John Martin hoped would be the Chicago of New Zealand. And when he was naming the streets of a new town, he decided to use the favourite places he'd visited on his world tour. In some cases, towns are cities, in other cases, favourite streets. So if you ever wondered why there's a Cambridge Street, a Cologne Street, a Cork Street, a Dublin Street, a Kansas Street, a Naples Street, a New York Street, an Ohio Street, an Oxford Street, a Panama Street, a Strasbourg Street, and a Suez Street, all in Martinborough, as well as a Texas Street and a Venice Street, well, that's because Johnny Martin really enjoyed visiting those places. And I just think it's delightful that he really enjoyed it so much that he named all his streets after his town. So when Johnny Martin was naming the streets, he loved it because Cambridge, for example, was established in the 13th century from pre-existing monasteries and affiliated schools, making up the university. And it's almost certain there was a Roman military outpost in that vicinity. In Anglo-Saxon times, the main trade route from central England to the continent passed over the bridge on the Cam River. So that's how Cambridge got its name. But I can't think if Cambridge Street passes over any rivers, and there's certainly not the Cam under it. But it's amazing to think that that was how the streets in Martinborough got their name. So if you are passing through, think about it. The Martinborough Town Hall is in Texas Street, and it was built in 1912. So right in the middle, really towards the end of the Edwardian era, and you can see that its facade was Edwardian, and it's still there. So, as we're talking about Edwardian eras, of course, one of the most important methods of travel in the early part of the 20th century was the train. And there's a very famous train, one of the last steam trains in New Zealand, called the Kingston Flyer. So I thought I might play an instrumental by a fabulous guitarist called Nigel Gavin, which is celebrating the Kingston Flyer. So here we go, the instrumental guitar solo, the Kingston Flyer.
Attention please, the Kingston Flyer is due to depart in 1 minute's time. All seated please.
Nigel Gavin and his instrumental about the Kingston Flyer. I hope you could hear in there, because I think I can, some some ideas about a train journey and, the rushing, because it was very exciting to be on a train in those days. Very amazing to think that there was travel by train was really important. And I just want to talk a little bit more about the book I've been reading, because I wanted to share it with you, because it's just delightful. So the talking about, of course, Rotorua was fascinating, because Rotorua was, of course, so different from anything that you could see in Europe. There certainly aren't geysers and hot springs and, of course, people actually living beside a thermal area and using it successfully for cooking and for baths and their daily lives. So the township was described as being well laid out, where broad streets planted with avenues of English trees intersect with each other at right angles, lined with little villas, each surrounded by its own garden, giving plenty of light and air and space, while the public gardens will more than bear comparison with the finest of the country. In summer, the place was crammed with visitors, but in the other seasons, a journalist recorded that the agents of the rival companies, including Thomas Cook, are ever on the warpath seeking new victims with a diligence which is almost beyond the comprehension of the average easygoing holidaymaker. As soon as tourists got off the train at Rotorua, they were besieged by agents looking to sell them tours, transport, accommodation, and just about anything else. One can but sympathise to a certain extent, this journalist wrote, with the agent who always contrives to show a cheerful and unruffled demeanour in the face of rebuffs which would daunt even an insurance canvasser. However, there was no doubt as to the scenic value of Rotorua, which had caused it to be the focal point for tourism in the country. So what they said in Thomas Cook's wonderful book, the sights are numerous and one can be fairly certain of having an enjoyable time no matter where the traveller is tempted to go. I run across Lake Rotorua to the picturesque Hamurana Spring, and then onto its more beautiful sister, Rotoiti, is by no means the least interesting method of putting in a day, while a motor climb up No Tongataha Mountain will reward anyone who tries it with one of the most glorious views it is possible to imagine. On the return trip, a peep at the fairy springs leaves one amazed at the multitude of trout who, for some unexplained reason, prefer to stow themselves away in a tiny pool packed like sardines in a tin, rather than venture into the broad waters of the lake. I just think that New Zealand must have seemed to visitors to be kind of familiar, because much of the countryside in New Zealand is very like the UK. Our climate is very similar, except that it's a little milder most of the time and a little warmer a lot of the time. But I think, it would, and because most people were, a lot of people who had settled here were British. And in Cobblestones, we have the lovely exhibit of a trunk which was brought over by one of our families who came to Greytown to settle. And we compare it with another trunk brought over by a Danish settler who came to settle a little bit further up the line. He settled towards Dannevirke in the northern area, beyond Morrisville, where there was a big Danish and Scandinavian settlements. And the comparison between those two is very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to see the different kind of settlers who came to New Zealand. So I really recommend it. Back to the streets of Martinborough. So we have Broadway Street, because Johnny Martin had visited Broadway as one of the principal business thoroughfares of New York City, and it runs north-south for 17 miles through the city to the Bronx. And it's the commercial and garment centre from 34th Street, while at the famed 42nd Street it becomes the centre of theatrical activity. And I have to say that one of the things that I noticed when I was in the United States of America myself is that it's very easy to find your way around cities because they number the streets. And if you know, and you're often given directions, for example, it's on the corner of 34th and Broadway. If you find Broadway and start walking, well, you're going to come to the street eventually, aren't you? Although if you start at number 1, it might be some blocks. Regent Street in Martinborough, of course, is named after one of London's most fashionable retail areas. Originally, Regent Street in London was a processional from Regent's Park to Regent's Palace, and it divides Mayfair from Soho. It actually still is there, and in fact, many years ago, my office was on Regent Street, right at Piccadilly Circus. And I'm talking about the mid-1970s now, when I just moved to London from living in Scotland. And I would often come out of my office building and be confronted by some lost tourists saying, "Oh, can you tell us the way to such and such a place?" And they would be very confused when suddenly this Scottish accent came out, trying to explain to them how to get to such and such a theatre, because it was often a theatre they were looking for. Sackville Street is another Martinborough street to be named after a fashionable London address. So obviously, Johnny Martin loved his visit to London and New York. Princess Street, of course, there are many Princess Streets around the world, and including one in Edinburgh. It seems that many of those streets were named to commemorate the marriage of Princess Alexandra of Denmark to Albert Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, who was, of course, the Edwardian era. And Memorial Square in the centre of Martinborough was occupied because because Johnny Martin had seen many squares like that on his travels abroad. He, of course, named the square Martin Square, and the main roads north and south and east and west originally ran through the very centre of the square. The open space was administered by a trust especially set up for the purpose, as the town did not have its own local authority. However, following the Boer War, a memorial was erected in honour of the men from the Martinborough area who had served in South Africa. Then after World War I, the square was dedicated as the town's official war memorial. The streets leading through the area were closed off, and a substantial ornamental fence erected. Governor-General Viscount Bledisloe officially opened the new Memorial Square in November 1921. And in the book that I'm reading from, Streetwise, How the Streets of Carterton, Greytown, Featherstone and Martinborough Got Their Names by Gareth Winter, there's some wonderful pictures of the opening and the original Roman Catholic Church and other streets in Martinborough. So I recommend you have a look at this book. You can buy it from Cobblestones, and it's a fund of information. Okay, so my book about touring Edwardian New Zealand, one of the bits I've been reading talks about the Taupo Napier Road, which has been the subject of a bit of contention recently because the speed limit was reduced on it to 80 kilometres an hour, a little bit like reducing the speed limits on some of our roads in the Wairarapa. And of course, in the Edwardian times, the speed limit was very much lower. And there's a lovely story in Cobblestones about our local policeman who used to hide, supposedly, and jump out and give speeding tickets to anyone who had the temerity to go over the speed limit, which I believe was something like 15 kilometres an hour. Or, of course, it would have been miles an hour in those days. But that's still not very fast. And it's interesting how we get very upset about changes, but then after a little while, we get really used to them. So we'll see what happens. But I thought I would play you a song from a friend of mine. It's called Party Town, which is about... Party Town is about Napier City, because Napier City was, of course, the nearest party town to the hinterland of the Hawke's Bay. And people used to come down into the party town at the weekend to party up. So here it is, the wild party town of Napier. I'm not totally convinced it's that wild, actually, but it is a lovely town to visit. So here we go, Party Town.
It's Friday night, the town's alight, the bars are packed and the weekend's welcome. Everybody's on the town to celebrate a week that's over. Party Town, yours and mine. Drinking beer, drinking wine, the streets are hot, the week is short. It's time for celebrating Party Town. Wellington, out on the streets, it's pumping, happy town. Party sounds, everybody's just hanging on the vibe. Everybody's getting high, blowing their mind. And then Saturday comes round again, race on out, create some mayhem. Summertime, yours and mine. The time to get half crazy, running wild, that crazy mile between Courtney Place and Manners Mall. Run around the bars in town, drinking, singing, it's amazing. Wellington, party town, out on the streets, it's pumping, happy town. Party sounds, everybody's just hanging on the vibe. Everybody's getting high, blowing their mind. You hit Cuba Street, you find a place to eat. Always when you've been drinking, you're hanging out for any food about. All that hype, what were you thinking? Music sounds all around. The bars and the nightclub venues, serious restaurants, fast food, French food, Asian, Mexican. Wellington, party town, out on the streets, it's pumping, happy town. Party sounds, everybody's just hanging on the vibe. Everybody's getting high, blowing their mind. And then without warning, it's Monday morning, blurry eyeballs, birdcage yawning. You stumble out, please don't shout. My head feels like exploding. 5 days again till the weekend. How will I survive the Monday? Can't think straight or concentrate. After 3 nights hard out party, Wellington, party town, out on the streets, it's pumping, happy town. Party sounds, everybody's just hanging on the vibe. Everybody's getting high, blowing their mind. And then it's Friday night, the town's alight, the bars are packed, the weekend's welcome, everybody's on the town. Celebrate a week that's over, party town, yours and mine. Drinking beer, drinking wine, the streets are hot, the week is shot. It's time for celebrating party town. Wellington, out on the street, it's pumping, happy town. Party sounds, everybody's just hanging on the vibe. Everybody's getting high, blowing their mind in party town.
Party Town. Well, that was actually about Wellington. I thought it was about Napier. I know that Alan has told me many stories of going into Napier and partying on Fridays and Saturday nights, as well as partying out in the hinterland. So I think he might have moved some of his ideas from Napier to Wellington. I know he's lived in Wellington for a long time now, when he moved back to Napier. So you can take the Hawke's Bay boy out of the Hawke's Bay, but it'll call him back again. So that's about it for today's show. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about touring Edwardian New Zealand a little bit, and I'm going to be telling you some more once I've read some more of that book. It's for those of you who are watching on television, I'll hold up this book. It's got a lovely, lovely cover of a drawing of two Edwardians looking at an amazing waterfall, and on the back it's got a lovely drawing of a train, which is one of the reasons I wanted to play the Kingston Flyer, because the Kingston Flyer would have been a very similar train to what they had. I really recommend it. And don't forget that at Cobblestones, this weekend on Sunday the 22nd, we've got the Zimmermans playing, as well as a lovely local act, young people. They're all in the final year at Wairarapa College, and they play fantastic music. Dragonfly, come along and hear them. You can get tickets from Event Finder, or just come along and you can get tickets on the door on Sunday afternoon. I would recommend coming a little bit earlier and bring a chair so that you can sit in the beautiful gardens and listen to the music. We'll have a cash bar available, and we'll have and some delicious food to eat. I know there's going to be ham rolls, and there's going to be beef rolls, there's going to be lamb rolls, there's going to be cheese platters, there's going to be wine and beer that you can buy, as well as soft drinks, and of course tea and coffee if you want some. And we also give you water, so water is free, so don't worry about that. Tickets are very reasonable for class acts like the Zimmermans and Dragonfly. $25 per adult, $10 for a student, $5 for a child, but obviously a child must be accompanied by an adult. $50 for a family ticket, and look, it's going to be just a wonderful afternoon. The Zimmermans are a class act. They're an 8-piece power band. They play all Bob Dylan music, and if you're a Bob Dylan fan, it will be fantastic. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll be back again. This show gets repeated every second Thursday, and I come in and chat every other Thursday. So looking forward to speaking to you again in the near future. Take care of each other, drive safely, see you again soon. Bye.